Hello and welcome to Writing Escapades with me, David Rawding. Today on the show, I have a guest. I have Brian S. Leon. Brian is an urban fantasy author. He has 3 books, and I think more on the way. Brian has a very interesting background. He has been in the military, he has been in the academic world, and he has been a fly fishing guide. He's he's got a lot more to that, and I'm really interested in learning more about him. So this is a part 1 of the 2-part interview, and stay tuned for part 2 coming in the next couple weeks. So without further ado, here's my interview with Brian S. Leon. One of the perks to having this YouTube channel and podcast is that I get to meet and talk with some of the internet pals I've had over the years. Today, I have urban fantasy author Brian S. Leon on the show. Brian has 3 published urban fantasy novels in a series known as the Metis Files. The 3 published books so far are Havoc Rising, Chaos Unbound, and Rebellion Reborn. Brian and I have the same publisher, and he's been kind enough to let me interview him today. So, Brian, I just wanted to start off by welcoming you to my Little Writing Escapades YouTube channel and podcast. It's great to have you on, and it's great to finally meet you.
Yeah, it's great to meet you too, Dave, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Anytime. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, how you got into writing and your novels?
Wow. Okay. So I usually tell everybody I'm kind of a jack of all trades. I have 7 degrees.
Wow.
Yeah, 5 bachelor's degrees, a master's degree, and a
Holy
PhD
cow.
in evolutionary biology. So that's useful. I was an academic, got kind of frustrated with academia and left and took a job as a magazine editor for 2 fishing magazines in Florida.
Okay.
And so that's kind of where the background came from as far as writing and everything. So I wrote hundreds of articles for fishing magazines for years, and then wrote stuff for other types of magazines and things like that as well. Published quite a bit in academia with regard to peer-reviewed articles and things like that related to my research. And then started fishing. We kind of talked about it a little bit before, but I started running a charter business. Was going to start it in Florida and decided, there's so many guides there that I wanted to go someplace a little bit different. And I had spent a lot of time in San Diego. I was in the military before, and then so I was stationed there, and I went to grad school for my master's degree at San Diego State. And so went back there to fish for a bit. And the problem is that you had all this downtime during the off season. And like I said, I could only check on the boat so many times.
Mm-hmm.
And I was kind of bored. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine and it was one of these weird conversations that weird people like me always have. Vampires and how you kill them and all the rest of this stuff. And I thought, if you hit them with a large enough, like a high explosive armor piercing round or a Raufoss round from a 50 caliber sniper rifle, that would do some damage. I don't care what it was, right? Would it bounce off of them? No, I would imagine it would obliterate them. Would it kill them? So I'm having these conversations, and I'm like, I can write about this. I could come up with a storyline based on this.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how my stories kind of got kicked off. And some of my degrees are related to anthropology. And so I spent a lot of time in folklore and mythology. I was always kind of that geek in high school and junior high and everything, read those kinds of books and that kind of stuff. Loved the Odyssey, and all of that. And just kind of started putting stuff together. And that's kind of how the writing kind of began. And just kind of pursued it. It took me a while to get published. I continued to write while I was doing that, but for my freshman year college literature professor, who said my writing was awful, I would love to tell him to stick it in his ear.
There you go. There you go. Nice. So your series, The Metis Files, is an urban fantasy series. What attracts you to the urban fantasy genre?
Again, for me, it's
Mhm.
just one of those weird things. I love the Marvel movies. I
Yes,
read comic books as a kid.
me too.
I loved mythology, anything that I could get into that was paranormal or supernatural or any of that kind of stuff. I loved reading that. I hate to say, as a scientist, as I grew up and went through school, I lost some of that. Just from an objective standpoint. But the idea that that stuff could be real or always kind of interested me. And then I love digging into mythologies and things like
Mm,
that. And one of the things that kind of got to me was every time I would read, and I loved, I came across Jim Butcher's books,
yes.
the stories about, Harry Dresden, the wizard and
Hmm.
everything. Those were awesome. But, what I was finding was, it's like everybody was reinventing all these myths. They would
Yes.
take them and which is fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. They would take the vampires and they would make them sparkly and they would come out in the daytime or they would do whatever. And me being me and my academic background, I started going back into the research of all of these creatures and myths and legends. And I was like, well, these are pretty interesting in and of their own right, right? Why do I need to modify them? Why can't I write a story that fits the myths and the legends as they currently exist? So when I write, I don't really modify my creatures and myths and legends
Mm,
very much. I try to fit them within those stories that already exist, and then just kind of work within it. And if you look around enough, you find that there are real issues that you can plug into them. So in my second book, I talk a little bit about uh, there was a blackout that happened in San Diego where literally the entire county was down for the better part of a day.
wow.
And it turned out to be some transformer up in North County, San Diego that
Okay.
went out. But I could come up with a better reason for why there
Yeah.
was
That's
that far, right?
awesome.
And
Yeah.
you start connecting, and you see other things. Like recently, I saw that there's a stone in Japan that's a death stone, and if you touch it, supposedly you would die instantly.
Mm,
And it supposedly held a demon from getting into this world,
mm.
and it cracked.
That's not
Right?
good.
So with
That's not
everything
good.
that's going on, COVID and all the rest of this stuff, but I'm sitting there thinking I can use that, right? I
Yes,
mean, I don't know what fantasy author wouldn't, especially,
that's true.
or who couldn't use that idea. But I mean, that's where my ideas kind of come from, right? It's
Mm,
like, wow, I mean, this is in our real world. Now, all I got to do is start looking at some myths and legends and try and, piece it together. And that's where the fun for me comes in. So,
mm. I can see that. I think you're living as a writer. Everything is potential fodder for a
yeah,
story. I
yeah.
like it. So I think we've kind of covered your mythology interest. My next question is, I liked how your first person point of view character of Diomedes, is it Diomedes or Diomedes?
You can add there are no. I've heard it pronounced both ways,
Okay.
and there's arguments for either way.
Hmm.
I pronounce it Diomedes,
Okay.
but actually had conversations with people who pronounce it Diomedes,
Hmm.
and
Sure.
I I like Diomedes, but
Yeah.
I'm not going to argue with anybody if they pronounce it slightly differently.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah,
take it up with Diomedes. All right.
right.
So the question, yeah, Diomedes, he often uses humor in Havoc Rising, and I enjoyed his sarcasm, dry wit, and dark humor. I laughed at the Brad Pitt Troy joke and the Harry Potter and the Die Hard references. How important do you think humor is for fiction? And do you think humor and sarcasm help the reader connect to your protagonist, guardian Diomedes Tydedes?
I I do. I think it does because again, not only that, but if you recall during the story, he has major issues with regard to women and dating and things
Hmm.
like that. He has a hard
Yeah.
time relating and understanding women. And of course, as the stories go on, he also starts to have problems relating to people in general. Right? He's been
Mm,
alive for so long and things like that. But the humor. and all of that, and the sarcasm and everything. For me, partly that's me, that's my personality, and partly I do think it makes it a little bit more reliable or relatable. And the other thing I think is, again, I'm writing these from kind of an entertaining standpoint. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
trying to, I mean, potentially some of these situations could be very, very heavy and intense.
Mm.
And I'd rather it not be such a heavy and intense book. These are supposed to be fun, right?
Yeah.
So for me, silly situations, and you'd be amazed at, honestly, in combat situations where silliness comes up, and how in the middle of something, it's like all of a sudden it's like you'll start laughing about something that comes out of nowhere. I think it's almost a survival mechanism. I think so by and large. Now, is it always that silly and sarcastic and sardonic? No. But again, like I said, these books are supposed to be entertaining. So you know but I think it is. Not all fiction needs it.
Mm-hmm.
I think depending on how you're writing, but again, for me, the way I write, I think it will always be kind of a critical part of how I write and what I write. But yeah, like I said, not all of it needs it, but
Yeah. As a reader, I definitely enjoyed it, and I kind of empathize with him because, if you're a guy, yeah, maybe dating just in a normal lifespan it can be a challenge. It could be um, it could be humorous at times. So I can imagine you throw on a somewhat eternal life. Yeah, that could make it even harder to connect with somebody.
absolutely, yeah.
One thing that fantasy depends on is kind of a mode of transportation across large spans quickly. Some authors use things like giant birds, dragons, teleportation. Others use spells and some other source of magic. In your book, your characters use waystones or waygates. How did you go about choosing this form of transportation?
So again, trying to figure out, one, you had to go from one place in the world to another place in the world relatively quickly. And
Mm-hmm.
the book that I'm currently writing, without trying to give away too much, he
Sure.
has to travel by kind of mundane methods, and
Mm.
it kind of, it really affects how he's able to do what he's able to do. But
Mm.
again, since all of my writing kind of depends on things that already exist rather than invent a new way or something else for him to travel. And it had to be low key, right? It couldn't be
Mm-hmm.
something as overt as a dragon flying through the air or
Yes.
something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing research on the telluric pathways, again, for another reason, and the way lines that traverse the earth and everything else.
Yeah.
And I'd run into some discussions that fairies and the fae can see these things, and that they have a more of an kind of innate connection to them, and the earth's energy fields and everything else. And in one of the pieces of the research that I did, people had talked about traveling by these ways,
Mm-hmm.
along these pathways and things like that. And I thought, okay, well, I can use this. And of course, being a human who's traveling through these pathways, Diomedes is going to have bigger issues because he doesn't
Yeah.
sense them the same way that the Fae and maybe the other creatures of the world might. And he's going to have issues. Whereas in the book, I talk about the two Fae that he travels with, the two brothers, Duma and Abraxos.
Mm-hmm.
They can pretty much navigate just like walking down the streets of their neighborhood that they've been down all their life. But he's got an issue, right?
Mm.
He's kind of dependent on knowing where the kind of the points connect, and where he can get off and where he can get on, and all of these things. And so, it's not an easy necessarily pathway for him to use, but it definitely is the most expedient. And like I said, it just came out of my research, kind of trying to kind of piece all these things together, and what made sense, and what was, again, kind of low key for him. Sure, he could borrow a helicopter from the Metis Files, or a
Mm-hmm.
jet, or whatever, from the Metis Foundation that he works
Mm-hmm.
for, and jet off or do something like that. But that's not always expedient, right? In
Mm-hmm.
one case in the book, he needs to get to a place really, really fast. And the only way I could think for him to be able to travel like that was something along those lines. So
I thought it was effective, and it was a kind of a quick. It happened kind of early where he uses it, so it kind of introduces you to this whole other world that's lying just beneath our own surface world, and I think it is useful. I mean, he could have just taken a plane, and it would have taken several days, but like time was an issue. He needed some sort of magical means, and he found it.
right, right, and again, he is not a wizard. He is not,
Mm-hmm.
and I go through this in the books
Mm-hmm.
because in urban fantasy, so many of the characters that I've read, they are wizards or magic users or sorcerers or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I specifically wanted to ground him in he is a soldier. He is kind of a blunt instrument, not the guy who's using magic. Now he's got some magic weapons and things like that that come from his mythology and where he comes from. But again, I didn't make those up, and I thought, how would a soldier do this? How would somebody who was trained in combat and that kind of a thing? And again, so he's not going to cast a spell. He's not going to do those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And so this made more sense to me.
Yeah. And in Havoc Rising, your protagonist, Diomedes, deals with lots of government departments, agencies, police, and has a military history. And the book also dips into the police procedural genre at times as well. My question is, how much research did you do to make these scenes accurate, and what experience do you have with these types of organizations and agencies?
Oh boy.
Yeah.
So I did lots of research. It's kind of in my background. As far as my involvement with some of them, I have worked with a few agencies when I was in the military. So I was special operations in the Navy. I was SEAL Team 1.
Oh, wow.
And so I spent quite a bit of time working with some of these agencies. Now, this is a long time ago, too, in the early 90s, before Homeland Security existed and those kinds of things. But I was familiar with kind of their predecessors and the FBI and how those things kind of worked. And over the years, I have known U.S. Marshals and other law enforcement agents and things like that. And so conversations with them and things like that kind of pull that in. Again, trying to keep things as accurate as I can. Now, in some cases, I did take some liberties just to make the flow go a little bit easier, but I try to keep them as realistic as they can be. I mean, honestly, this guy's running around. He's 3,000 years old. He's got swords. He's, there's got to take some leeway because it wouldn't fly for too long. Some guy running around doing these kinds of, outside the bounds of reality. So yeah, you got to take some leeway, but again, I try to keep everything within the bounds of accuracy as best I can, keep things as accurate and realistic as possible. Because to me, again, that's part of how, for me writing, how I keep things kind of interesting. I want it to be, wow, if this guy really existed, this is exactly how this would happen, right?
Yeah.
This is kind of how that would be. And, given they're vampires running around with him, you got to take some liberties with that. But yeah. So a lot of research, a lot of my own kind of background, and then I get a lot of questions asked whether Diomedes, because of my background, whether Diomedes is based on me. No, Diomedes is based on the character from the Iliad. I just took it to a logical conclusion. He was an elite warrior at the time. If you read the Iliad, most people forget about Diomedes because Achilles was the brash, kind of egotistical hero that everybody remembers. However, Diomedes was the quiet, professional soldier within the Iliad. He was the one who got things done, and he was actually more feared on the battlefield than Achilles was. And he caused more damage to the Trojans than even Achilles did. And even then, he's the only mortal to ever wound not one, but 3 gods in the same day on a battlefield as a mortal. Now, he had Athena's help. And people may remember that Athena favored Odysseus, but Diomedes is the only human that she ever, according to the myths and legends, that she ever appeared to in her true form. So when she appeared to Odysseus, she appeared as different people or different creatures or things like that. But Diomedes, she favored so much so that she actually appeared to him in her true form. And yeah, so again, trying to keep all that stuff together. That's why he's, again, because of my background, I can write about those kinds of things. And like I said, trying to keep a professional soldier from that standpoint. I mean, what would he have done? Like you said, he's not a wizard. He's not a magic guy. He would have done what he knew, and that was being part of the military unit and serving from that standpoint. So the history of him, as you read through all of my books, there's him involved in all kinds of different special military units, including the Musketeers back during
that's awesome.
And actually, I write about that. And again, a lot of people think, okay, well, the Three Musketeers and D'Artagnan and all the rest of that. Well, D'Artagnan was a real individual. And the D'Artagnan romances that Dumas wrote, and Dumas is one of my favorite authors, were loosely based on this hero who was killed at the Battle of Maastricht. And so I wrote in a story, and one of the things that most people don't realize is that most of the Musketeers were actually mercenaries. They were not French. The French thought, okay, we can either fight against these guys or we can hire these guys. And so most of the Musketeers were not French. And the Gray Musketeers in particular, the unit that D'Artagnan led, was comprised mostly of mercenaries. And so it only fit that I could get him into that situation. And so he fought along D'Artagnan and was there when D'Artagnan dies. And of course, I have a whole story regarding that. And of course, because if he's there, it's not just battle, right? He doesn't show up when it's just a mortal conflict.
Yeah.
So if he's there, there's something else that's going on. So, kind of go into that. And again, without dismissing the idea that some things are just human conflicts, I ran into that early, trying to explain some conflicts as some supernatural influence. And somebody that read one of my early beta readers was like, well, why can't they just be human conflicts, right? Why do they all have to have a supernatural explanation? And I was like, yeah, you're right. Not everything is going to be a supernatural issue. So,
yeah, he is guardian, though. His job is to basically be the sword for his boss Athena, and
right.
Yeah. My next question is that your story has this contemporary world that overlaps with a magical and mythological world hiding just beneath the surface. Havoc Rising has a lot of magical and mythological figures, and creatures, including goblins, gods, fae, trolls, zombies, demons, elves, vampires, and wizards. These are just some of the characters that appear in your story. How did you pick and choose which magical and mythological creatures to include in your book?
Kind of by interest and by where the story kind of draws me. So I don't bind myself to one particular mythology. So while Diomedes comes from Greek mythology, the first book kind of revolves a lot around that, just because the protagonist in the novel comes from Greek mythology as well. But vampires are, some of the vampires, actually the earliest known vampire myths are Greek, but the traditional ones that we know about are Eastern European. In my subsequent books, the second book, there's a lot of Asian mythology that goes on, and in the third book, there's a lot of kind of Christian and Judaic mythology that comes into play. And so a lot of the creatures have to do with the things that are related to those mythologies and those situations, and where he is. So if he's in Japan, right, he's going to be fighting creatures or dealing with creatures and of legend from those areas. And if he's in a certain, again, when in Havoc Rising, when he's in the Bulgarian forest, he's going to run into creatures that they talk about in Bulgaria, the fae that he runs into there, and those situations. And again, kind of drawing into my overall storyline of kind of where the main protagonist kind of comes from, and what are the things I can kind of drag into it. And then again, some things you do just kind of have to make up. So the protagonist in my second book is made up, but he's made up from kind of the legends based on Merlin, who is what is referred to as a cambion, right? So he's half human, half demon. A lot of people aren't aware of that aspect of Merlin's mythology.
I wasn't aware. Yeah,
as a cambion. And so I thought, okay, well, this could be interesting. I could create a cambion type character, a half demon, half fae, right? And this thing would be, and I gave him a title that was based on a Welsh kind of legend called the Hanner Bryd, which means half-breed.
Okay.
And as a half-breed, he was not welcomed into the fae community, and he's not welcomed into any other community. And so this guy is a rogue out there doing things, kind of out on his own and things like that. And so, again, I'll see things and it's like, okay, can I use this? How can I use this? What can I do? Like I said earlier with the Death Stone in Japan that cracked and there's the demon. Well, gee whiz, I'm sure I can figure out some way to bring that up, right?
Yep.
And things like that. And in my third book, like I said, which has a lot of Christian and Judaic kind of mythologies, I even go back into some of the stuff, the apocryphal texts and things from the Bible, and pulled out various different pieces and parts and talked about the Watchers. And they become a big part of my mythology for the third book, and them trying to get back into, having been imprisoned in a realm somewhere out in the other dimensions, how they're getting pulled or trying to get back into being on Earth, which is where the Watchers were before they started the war of the angels between heaven and earth and everything else, and all the rest of that. Again, Christian mythology about the war between heaven and the angels and Satan and all that stuff. So, kind of getting into all of those kinds of things. And it's just, just kind of following where that stuff goes. And that's how the creatures come out. In some cases, I'll run across a creature that's so cool, I got to figure out how to get it in there. And it may have nothing to do with anything other than I got to get this thing in there, right? Yeah. This thing's got to be in there. And that's, kind of how things kind of pull together. And it's funny how the stories kind of will write themselves, and then all of a sudden it'll be like, oh, this is the perfect place to put a whatever, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, you're a well-read man.
Again, it's the research part, right? It's always been my background to kind of dig into stuff, and I'll find, a nugget of information about something, and I got to know more, right? How does this work? Where's this from? In the book that I'm currently working on, it was very similar, right? So you come across this story about this creature, and it's like, wow, that's interesting. So then you start digging into it, and you realize, oh, wow, there's all this mythology around this thing, and wait a minute, there's this way to control it. He doesn't have to beat it up. He can actually control it if he has this thing or this, and how is he going to get this, and what about this, and yeah. So like I said, all of a sudden, then things start to snowball. So
yep, I see that. All right, next question. I read in an interview on coffeeaddictedwriter.com that you said, quote, "Someone described my first book as Tom Clancy meets the Iliad," end quote. And after reading your book, I have to agree. I'd even go further and say it reminds me of Lee Child's Jack Reacher meets the Blade comics, meets the Neil Gaiman's American Gods. What I'd like to know is, what books, shows, and movies influence you?
Oh man, all kinds of things. So obviously the Odyssey, the Iliad, those classics were huge influences on me. Jim Butcher's books, I don't even remember when I picked them up the first time, but I remember finding out that I was like 7 books in. The one that I picked up was like number 7.
Oh yeah.
And I'm thrilled to death, right? There's 6 books before this. And I've read all of his books. Preston and Child has always been, their writing has always been really interesting to me. Obviously, books like Lee Child's Jack Reacher,
Hmm.
those books have been kind of influential. I always loved David Morrell's books.
All right, that ends part one. Now look for part two of my two-part interview with Brian S. Leon in a couple weeks. See you then, guys.